Now that we've seen how require and module.exports works, let's look at some different ways we can use this feature to structure our modules in Node.js. Now there's no one right way to do this. It's an architectural choice. So let's look at a few different module patterns in Node. To do this, we'll start with an empty app.js file and we'll build a few different greeter modules. Let's start by adding a new file. I'll say greet1.js because we'll make several. In this one, I'll do what we did before. I'll say module.exports. Again, this is available to me because of the fact this code is wrapped inside a function. And I'll set it equal to a function expression here. Now notice that exports, when I first get it, is an empty object. And what I'm actually doing is overwriting it. So this is our first pattern, overwriting exports with a function. So we're giving back a single function and replacing the empty object that we got with this single function. And then when I go to require it, I simply set a variable equal to the results of the require function. I'll say greet1 this time because that's the name of the JS file. And because I replaced exports with a function, instead of being an empty object, it's just a function, that's what will come back from require, and so I can just call that function because this variable is pointing at it. And so if I run this, hello world. So that worked. And that's the pattern we've already seen. Let's try something different though. Instead, I'll create another JS file. Let's call it greet2.js. And this time, instead of replacing that empty object that's already there for me on the exports property of the module object, I'll just add a new property to that empty object. So I'll say .greet, and I'll do the exact same thing. Console.log hello world. Now, how would I use this when I require this module? Well, remember, require returns module.exports, and that will still be an object. It started off as empty, but now I've added a new property to it. That's a function, so it's a method. I've added a method to the exports object. So when I go back to my app.js file, and I'll just say greet2 equals require, then get that greet2.js file. What greet2 will contain is module.exports. So I could do this one of two ways. I could just take greet2 as an object and call that function that I added to it. Or what's much more common is to say explicitly what it is that I'm looking for coming off of the module.exports object when it comes to these methods. So I might say .greet. Why? Because again, greet is a method on the exports object, exports.greet. So this is module.exports, that's what's coming back from require, and I can just put .greet right on the end of that because the function returns an object, and then I can say I want a property on that object. So now greet2 is the function, and I can call it the same way. See that? We try it. And there, it worked. So when you see that dot something after require, we're reaching down into that module.exports object and getting a particular property or method. That's pattern 2. For another pattern, let's create another JavaScript file, greet3.js. And this time, instead of replacing exports with a function or attaching a method to the empty object that exports starts its life as, I'll replace exports with my own object. To do that, I'll choose to use a function constructor. There are a number of ways to create objects in JavaScript. The newest version, ES6, adds the class keyword as an option to create objects. There's also something called object.create. I'll just use a regular function constructor, and I'll add a property to my object called greeting, because this keyword points to the newly created object when you use the function as a constructor. So I can add greeting to my newly created object and a greet method to my newly created object, and I'll just say console.log this.greeting. So I have a function constructor, and then here's the pattern, module.exports. I'll replace that empty object with my own object, and I'll use new greeter. So I'll use the constructor and create a new object with that constructor and have exports be that new object. Now, how will I use this? The same way as before. I'll go back to app.js. I'll get the results of the require function, which will go get this file, and I'll simply get it, and it will give me back that object, the newly created object from the constructor, which means that greet3 is now that object, and I can then just call the greet method. So if I run this through Node, there's my third hello world. Now, this actually leads us to something that can cause some confusion when you're using modules in Node.js. Notice that running this code causes module.exports to create a brand new object. That's fairly straightforward. But here's a question. What happens if I did something like this, 3b, and I require the exact same file over again? What will this contain? A different object or the same object? Well, to test that, let's change the greeting here, the greeting property, to changed hello world. And then I'll call greet3b.greet. So I've called my greet3.js file to be processed. I've executed the greet function, that method, and then I changed that property, which this method uses to log. And then I've called require again on the same file. So which greeting do you think I'll see? The one that's defined in the function constructor, or this one here on the object I've changed? Let's see. Node app.js. And look at that. That fourth one, even though I called require again, greet3b ended up being the same object as greet3. Why is that? To answer that question, we need to step into the require function one more time. So I'll set a breakpoint and then debug this. I'll simply let it get the object back the first time we call require and ask for greet3. I'll step over that, and then I'll step into the second time that we call require. We drop down into the JavaScript code in the Node core, and notice that there was a spot that we skipped over when we drilled through this before, where it looks for a cached module of that particular file name. What require does is it actually caches, that is, stores the results of the require function for any particular file name. So in other words, whatever I have hanging on to module.exports, I will have in cache here. And then that will be returned instead. Notice that if I step down, I'm actually returning cached module.exports. And then we come back up, and because it's an object, it will end up being a reference to the same object that was originally created here in this initial require call. So the first time Node saw the require function being called for this file name, inside the require function, it cached the results. It cached what came back, that is to say module.exports. It saved it. And the next time that I called require, using that same file name, it went and said, oh, I already know what came back in module.exports from that file, and I'll just give you that. And since it's an object, it turns out to be a reference, so it ends up being the same object, the same location in memory as the other require function. And so the change that I made to that object is reflected here as well, because both greet3 and greet3b end up pointing at the same object. So even though inside my greet3 it calls new greeter, this code here, this module.exports line, is only ever run once, because the results are then cached, and that's what's given back in any subsequent require calls. And that includes across different JavaScript files. So I might use require multiple times across my Node application, calling the same file, the same module in different places where I need it, but will only ever really be called once. And so that's extremely efficient, and also allows me to create a single object that can then be referenced and used in different ways across my application. That turns out to be highly useful, and we'll see that a bit later in the course. But for now, let's call this pattern 3. So I'll stop this. Now, what if I didn't want to have the same object come back from require all the time? Well, I could simply change what I attach to module.exports, or what I replace it with. For example, I'll create a new file, greet4.js, and I'll go ahead and grab the same function constructor, but instead I'll replace that exports object with the function constructor itself. So instead of creating the new object, I'll simply give back from my module the ability to create the new object. And then if I go to app.js, I'll get rid of this breakpoint here, and then I'll say var greet4 equals require greet4. And now in order to create a new greeter object, I would then have to say new greet4, because greet4 is now a constructor function. To be clear that it's a constructor, I'll make it a capital G. And then I can call .greet. And let's make this 3 exclamations just to see the difference. All right. I'll clear this, and there it is. Now in this case, I'm creating the new object myself in my line of code, so I can keep creating new greeters and they will not be the same object, because I'm not calling the require function anymore. I'm simply using the function constructor that came back from it. So that's pattern 4. And also note these last 2 that we looked at, we could also do the variation of, instead of replacing the exports object, we could simply attach a method or a property to the exports object. And so we could have attached this new object instead as a new property, or attached the function constructor itself. And then in app.js, we might have just used the dot property right after the require, or grab the whole object and then grab the property afterward. But it's very similar in either case. It's just that variation of attaching it to the object as a property, or replacing the whole exports object itself. Now let's show one more pattern, and it's one we've already seen somewhat. I'll add a new file, greet5.js, And this pattern is extremely popular and useful in JavaScript. I'll create a variable, let's say. I could have a number of variables. This one will hold the greeting. I'll create a function. Let's call it greet. And I could have a number of functions. And then I'll replace my exports property with a new object, and I'll use object literal syntax to make it quick to create. And I'll set a name and a value. Now, we did this before, but notice that I'm only exposing the function, not this variable. So when greet is executed, and this is the name greet, and this is the value, which is the actual function, and they're named the same again, just to make it easy to track what's going on. When greet is executed, the way JavaScript works, it will still have access to this greeting variable. But since module.exports is what is returned from this module, I won't have direct access to the greeting variable outside the module. So I could have a number of other functions and variables and logic that is not exposed outside the module. I simply reveal only the functions, only the methods, the properties, the values that I want someone to actually be able to use. And everything else remains hidden or private. This is called the revealing module pattern. Oh. Big word alert. The revealing module pattern. This is where we expose only the properties and methods we want from a module via a returned object. This is very common and a very clean way to structure and protect our code within a module. So we might have various functions, logic, variables, but we only expose what we want, and that keeps the usage of the module outside the module from allowing any accidental adjustments to things that the module needs to work. So it's a way for us to make the module useful, but at the same time protect its contents. And so to use this, I'll go back to my app.js file. I'll say greet5. And then greet5 will be that object that I revealed from module.exports. Or I could use the alternative and simply get the direct property that I actually want. And then greet5 will be that method. So I can call it. And then if I run this, there's that last hello world. But notice there's no way for me to really change the greeting property or access it because it wasn't on the object that was returned. It wasn't revealed to me when I went to use the module via the require function. So that greeting variable is protected. And this is useful structurally, as are all of these patterns. And again, there's no one right way to do this. This is an architectural choice. But you can imagine structuring your modules in various ways, depending on how you want them to be used and how you want to use them throughout your application. And also remember that if you simply return an object from require, that will be cached, and any other call to that same file via the require function will get you back the same object everywhere. Well, that's it. Those are some common module patterns in Node. So try them out for yourself. See what kind of patterns you like. See what kind of things you find useful, feels well structured to you, makes you happy. All right, let's move on with the course.